Florida has had that sort of amorphous sense about it, that it's a temporary place.
Since the late 1970s, Florida has been on a joyride of growth. It is proudly boasted that more than 1,000 people a day move into the state.
People are moving into Florida, they're moving about Florida, or they're moving out of Florida. And so that creates this absence of any relationship with your neighbors.
The constant stream of new Floridians fueled an appetite for land development, speculation, and quick profits.
We wrote a lot of policies and we wrote a lot of regulations, but we never had an overarching vision of what did we want to be like when we were developed.
But in 2008, the real estate boom that many believed would last forever crashed, shattering Florida's promise as a fountain of wealth.
We were on the General Motors track for the last 50 years. And if you want to stay on the General Motors track for the next 50 years, you're going to go bankrupt.
Now, for the first time since the 1940s, more people are leaving Florida than arriving. Today, the state is awash in crises, from foreclosures to water management to faltering infrastructures.
We cannot continue to depend on growth as the major economic engine that it has been for most of the last half century. Florida has got to begin to develop a more diversified economy.
Has the Florida dream morphed into the Florida nightmare? Or will Floridians set a new path towards sustainable growth and begin imagining a new Florida?
Florida is a good place to learn lessons about how to build authentic communities, because the question of authenticity and the question of community are at the heart of our identity as a state.
This program was made possible by the Florida Humanities Council. We come from all over, and we become one state, where we share in the history and become part of the culture that is Florida. The Florida Humanities Council, bringing Floridians together by sharing the stories of our state. And by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Developers have had their day and they've done well by it, but they've also left a lot of consequences that are not paid for.
Florida today is home to more than 18 million people. By 2030, Florida's population is expected to exceed 24 million. It is hard to imagine that in 1845, when it became a state, Florida had fewer than 55,000 people, no manufacturing, and no urban centers. Its one exploitable asset was land.
Florida was an open state. 1845, there were almost no people living here. They located Tallahassee in the center of what they thought was Florida at the time. But the state itself was exploiting. During those times, there were probably at least a third of the land area of the state was given away by the state itself, and primarily for speculation.
Throughout the 19th century, Florida's commercial agriculture flourished. Small industries such as cigar manufacturing took hold. By the 1870s, tourists from the north sought out the mild climate and natural beauty. By the end of World War I, developers and speculators descended on the state, creating whole towns from open land, all built on the promise of profits. In the 1920s, urban planner John Nolan called Florida the great laboratory of town and city planning. Like many architects, developers, and urban planners who had come to Florida from elsewhere, Nolan brought a vision of possibilities. These possibilities would coalesce around a belief that Florida possessed a unique sense of place as a natural paradise.
Since the 1920s, people have come here to escape and live like Ponce de Leon, or live this life in paradise.
Utopian visionaries such as Nolan saw Florida as a national icon for states interested in rational expansion of their living space. By contrast, Early developers, such as Coral Gables founder George Merrick, saw Florida's exotic beauty as a marketing lure to attract leisure-class residents and tourists.
And when you think about some of the wonderful communities that were laid out in the 1920s, the ambitions really are extraordinary. I mean, they really had everything you could possibly want in a community. And it's important in this respect to remember that in Florida, one had not only the opportunity to create new communities where people would come by choice, not because they came for jobs. They had to be lured there by the lifestyle. And so planning in some of these towns really incorporated the best of what community life could offer. It really had all the elements of public and private life all sewn up into one package.
Unfortunately, the real estate crash of 1926 and subsequent depression temporarily ended Florida's flirtation with lavish urban designs. Yet change was on the horizon for the Sunshine State. Florida was poised to undergo what one author called Florida's Big Bang.
Everybody expected the suburbs, but what would they look like? The ambition was that the suburbs would be great communities, that they would be satellite communities to vibrant cities that already existed.
Following World War II, there was an enormous demand for housing. Aided by affordable mortgages, an emerging interstate highway system, and cheap gas, the suburbanization of America took hold as never before. Florida, with its endless sunshine and abundant land, quickly attracted those looking for affordable suburban living.
My father was up in Wakulla Springs, and he made sure we were going to move down here. And the bottom line was there was this mass immigration into Florida, and the quickest, cheapest way to do it was subdivide land in a quick, efficient manner. So it's almost a factory regimen. Just like you're turning out goods in a factory, we were turning out subdivisions. So in a way, it made sense.
After World War II, when the next generation was built, no one really was thinking about that they were going to be building another component of city. It just started housing subdivision by housing subdivision. The highways were being made to connect the whole country. Those highways became convenient access to these new subdivisions. They would need new shopping. And there really wasn't, at that time, a planning mechanism to make integrated towns.
And without a planning mechanism, developers found a profitable model of suburbia that worked and could be replicated over and over and over, stifling innovations in design and development of fully integrated communities.
And I think had the choice between really well-planned communities and these rather unplanned communities been out there, we probably would have had better planned communities. But I think that it became more economically desirable just not to provide the planning.
Local governments viewed suburban growth as a stimulus for jobs, infrastructure improvements, and an expanded tax base. So it was easy to accommodate the desires of developers and ignore the negative impacts of sprawl.
Everything in the suburban landscape is designed to be moving at 35 miles an hour. So when you're going 35 miles an hour, you want to be able to make sure you can see Burger King and McDonald's. In a certain way, it makes sense. So the reason they look like big cartoons is at 35 miles an hour, you could see them. Now, if you're walking by them, my God, this is ugly, and it's spaced out. So it's not designed for the human being. And we basically went from designing our towns being designed by landscape architects and architects who are really concerned that you look at the beauty of the landscape in a building, being designed by traffic engineers who do formulas and want to make sure you move efficiently through the landscape. And they don't care about beauty, they care about their formula. So what you have is a landscape designed for movement and movement only.
The reliance on the automobile, according to many critics of suburbia, has made life less livable. Long commutes, bumper-to-bumper traffic, shuttling kids to every activity, all have contributed, says urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg, to the loss of community and what he calls third places.
The third place is our informal public gathering places, and the best of them are within walking distance. Most people don't have these places nowadays, and those that do usually find they have to drive to them. So what used to be a more casual kind of behavior has become as scheduled. I can't imagine growing up as a child, growing up in a subdivision. To me, it seems just terrible. It's nothing to do, no place to go.
There's a substantial percentage of people who just are very satisfied with the cul-de-sac, the three-car garages. You know, they even like the distance between work and the house. You know, they love that. They love driving their kids around. They love drive-throughs.
One of the most pernicious aspects of post-war suburbs were the fact that all uses were separated. You have the housing in one area, you have the shopping in another, you have the churches and synagogues in a third place, and the office parks somewhere else. The whole thing was made possible by the car.
The negative impact of the separation of use can be best illustrated by Orange County and the city of Orlando. Starting in the 1980s, the county experienced incredible growth that far exceeded its projections. Its first big industry was defense contractor Martin Marietta. Then came the Sac Air Force Base. Then the University of Central Florida needed cheap land for expansion. And finally, Disney, which wanted huge parcels of empty land. So Orange County had all of these major activity centers out on the edges, away from the city, and subdivisions began filling the spaces in between.
I do sort of feel that we did not manage our growth well, that we did not have development patterns that really were sustainable over time. We've got lots and lots of sprawling subdivisions that I think will one day be a ring of slums around the city. We could have done better planning, but it's hard to plan in the midst of just overwhelming, unanticipated growth. I think we didn't try hard enough to preserve the special places that served neighborhoods, but I think we were so into building gated subdivisions with walls around them that didn't connect to anything. You had to get in your car and drive 5 miles to get a loaf of bread, that we forgot to create the special gathering places.
Preserving and creating special places is the challenge facing Florida today. Traffic jams, endless housing tracts, and neighborhoods devoid of people are all symptoms of our lives amid sprawl, creating, as Richard Moe of the National Trust for Historic Preservation observed, the graveyard of livability.
When you can take a pasture and build nothing but houses, you can get a return on your money much faster than if you build real community. That is to say, with a lot of diverse destinations in one small area. New homes in the United States are twice as large as new homes in Europe. Why are they so large? Given also that families get smaller, homes get larger, because the home has to substitute for community. You buy everything you can afford and a lot of things you can't afford to make the home more entertaining. But again, what's lost in the process is community.
My personal belief is that Florida is very built out, perhaps too built out. And I think that the virgin growth phase, the first development phase of Florida, should probably come to an end. We probably shouldn't be developing new communities, greenfield communities on open land. When one flies over the state or when one looks at aerial photographs, the state is becoming more and more interconnected with a network of suburbs and exurbs that almost leave few areas for wilderness, for agriculture, for other uses. And I think that if one is going to preserve the kind of multiplicity of environments that a state like Florida has now, it has national parks, it has wetlands, it has forests, it has large agricultural districts, then one really needs to put growth limits on new communities and focus on redeveloping the communities that we have.
A prime example of the consumption of agricultural lands can be seen along the US 27 corridor.
That corridor 50 years ago was just all citrus trees. As far as you could see, there were citrus. Today it's houses and public supermarkets and all kinds of stuff along the highway. In fact, it's made the highway almost impassable. That's not the vision. That's sprawl development by its worst name. If we really need to concentrate on the urban areas and in increasing densities, making them quite livable, and places where people can live and shop without getting too far stretched in their automobiles and that sort of thing.
People have to be invested in their community, both physically and financially, that they have to be willing to make sacrifices. And I think people see Florida as a place to escape to, not a place to come to and sacrifice.
Journalist Max Lerner wrote in 1957 about the problem of place in America and the quest for community. Unless the problem was resolved, he argued, American life will become more jangled and fragmented than it is.
I would say a lot of Florida developments lack a sense of community. Clearly, Florida is an importer of its citizens. You know, we're a big destination for retirement, for jobs, low income tax rates, no state income tax. So we tend to import most of our population. And as a result, you know, you can see it in our communities, our sports teams. There's not a lot of loyalty because nobody's from here. I'm an exception, but people aren't from here. So I think there can be a lack of a sense of community within communities because people are not necessarily bound by common roots.
A 2007 New York Times cartoon depicted Florida as the United States of Florida. It noted, wryly, that cold weather refugees tended to cluster together according to their place of origin.
Many people tend to think that the history of Florida started on the day they came across the state line, and they would like to freeze it at that point. I'm a strong believer that you can't lead people to the future unless you have a good grounding in how we got to the present. And for many Floridians, there isn't that understanding of the history of our state and the cultural development of Florida.
And this lack of knowledge, critics argue, contributes to a lack of community and sense of place.
In Florida, the lack of community is often associated with the Cincinnati syndrome. The Cincinnati syndrome is something you see on the obituary page. John Smith was born in Cincinnati, moved to Florida when he was in his 20s, established his family, his business, his civic context. Sadly, he passed away yesterday. The service will be held tomorrow. On Friday, the body will be returned to Cincinnati for burial. John is an example of the Floridian who never made the full transfer from his previous home to his new home in Florida.
Well, I think community has a lot to do with a sense of identity, of belonging to a place, of being rooted in an environment. The whole state was largely developed on undeveloped land, on new land, and there were few pre-existing communities here. The state is largely a series of new communities or new cities looking for a sense of community.
The Fifth Avenue Pleasant Street neighborhood is one of Gainesville's earliest communities. The eastern section of the neighborhood was part of the original grid of Gainesville, which was founded in 1854.
As a result, this neighborhood has within itself everything that the rest of Gainesville has, but in a compressed area. There are schools, there are churches, there are restaurants, there are barber shops, grocery stores traditionally, and all of those things over time were self-contained and to some extent still are self-contained.
As the neighborhood evolved over the years, it became a community within itself. Its narrow streets, small lots, and placement of houses all contributed a public character to the neighborhood.
I care about two things in this neighborhood. One is the physical fabric, what I would call the physical fabric, the quality of the architecture, the way the streets are laid out, the way the houses front the streets, the scale of the architecture, and I hope that it will be possible for the neighborhood architecturally to be preserved and enhanced as it is. So that's one hope. And the second hope is that 50 or 100 years from now, anyone who lives here, whether they're African American or not, whether their families lived here for 100 years or not, that they'll recognize the history of the neighborhood.
The United Methodist Church has been part of that history from the beginning. The Reverend Geraldine McClellan serves as its pastor.
This congregation has played a real role in the community. It is still that third place in the lives of people, especially now and more so now with the economy being like it is. It's just been that place where the church has opened its arms to receive community ministries in, to provide the kind of help and safe haven that people in the community naturally would not have.
For the past several years, the church has run a food pantry. Every Thursday, up to 200 people line up to receive help.
Yes, ma'am. How are you doing this morning? Community means to me the people in the community feeling comfortable with everybody else that they're living around, knowing that they can help, and they can also receive help if needed.
What I love about the neighborhood is that once you start reading oral histories of the neighborhood and talking to people who live here and understanding how the neighborhood works, you understand that it's a story of struggle, but also of overcoming struggle.
The Fifth Avenue neighborhood lies within the core of downtown Gainesville, a downtown that has retained a vibrant small-town atmosphere.
The people who live here really understand how to create communities. They probably learned that from their parents, who learned it from their parents, who learned it from their parents, and so forth. And that's not something that you can force to happen just because of the architecture.
Billed as America's friendliest hometown, The Villages is the largest retirement community in Florida, sprawling across 3 counties.
Well, this is the first neighborhood that we visited when we were taking a look to buy a home in the Villages, and we've been here, what, just about?
Oh, about 5 years, just over 5.
5 years, and having lived 30 different places, I think we're done moving now. This is everything that we hoped for.
In 2000, about 8,000 folks lived here. Today, there are more than 78,000 retirees. As the marketing brochure claims, whatever your retirement dream, you're sure to find it here.
We have so many more things, so many more choices to do down here than we ever did at our old home, where we thought we were going to be happy for the rest of our life.
The Villages is all about mass. It has 32 neighborhoods, 52 recreation areas, 40,000 golf carts, 70 miles of golf cart paths, and 1,400 activities and clubs. It has its own radio and television stations and 2 newspapers. The top sports are golf and pickleball.
Very, very popular sport.
But the Villages, with its hyperactive lifestyle, still has its critics.
Well, one, you have to be over 55 to live there, so it's not really a community. It's a great place to live your golden years, but it's not a true community. You know, you're cutting yourself off literally from the reality of life. And I think when people move to the Villages, that's what they want. They don't want to deal with the realities. They want to play golf and, God knows, disco and engage in a hedonistic pleasure cruise.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to do it again.
The real challenge, I think, for the Villages is it going to appeal to the baby boomers? I'm skeptical. I think baby boomers are more independent. I think that kind of community which appealed to their parents is going to be less appealing to them. On the other hand, it's clear that seniors desire something that speaks to their needs at that point in life, and that the Villages has provided that.
I think that the biggest problem with creation of real places, real community, is we think that because we control architecture, we should also control what people do and what they want to do. It's wrong. Real community happens much, much faster if you just create a palette and you let people go.
I remember Florida, when I was a girl, Florida was a wonderful place. Old Florida is something I still search for when I travel through the state.
Modern suburbia, according to Professor David Brain, has created a profound disconnection between community and place, which in turn produced an equally profound longing for what we call a sense of place. While a sense of place is difficult to define, it has, by most accounts, three ingredients: identity, relations, and history. Cedar Key, off Florida's west coast, is an example of what many would call authentic old Florida. The Cedar Keys are a cluster of islands close to Florida's mainland. Seminoles, Spanish sailors, pirates, the U.S. Army, and settlers have all called Cedar Key home. The island community has been an important port and a railroad terminus. At the start of the 20th century, fishing, sponge hooking, and oystering became the major industries. Today, Cedar Key remains a fishing village and a tourist attraction. Its Chamber of Commerce likes to say that time stands still here in Cedar Key.
I think the fact that Cedar Key is an island at the end of a very long, narrow road has always given it a sense of its own identity. One element that makes Cedar Key a community is that the people live close to each other there and there's nobody else nearby, essentially. It just takes time to make a community, and Cedar Key has been around for at least 150 years. There are families who have lived there for 6 or 7 generations.
And I think that sense of place develops when you have the trials and the tribulations, the good and the bad, and all that comes with living in a community with maybe folks you don't understand, and you get to understand them. Maybe you have arguments and differences, but that's one of the great things about a place like Cedar Key.
More than half, well, probably 2/3 of the residents have post office boxes downtown. And we all meet at the post office. I see people at the post office and we communicate about what's going on in town every day. And that is really a very important interchange, social interchange.
About 100 miles southeast of Cedar Key is another small town that still holds the flavor of old Florida, Dade City. A ride aboard the Dade City trolley takes you on a tour of the city's historic past.
Dade City was founded in 1847. Citrus was big in this town even before it was founded. Millionaires were made all the way up to the 1890s. But in the 1980s, more impact freezes came through Dade City and really put an end to the citrus industry. Pasco Packing had to close. Many people lost their grows. But as you'll see as we go around town, it's still a very vibrant little town.
And it's remained a vibrant little town because the old citrus groves attracted developers who built houses and commercial malls, which in turn attracted newcomers.
In this area, which is considered a small town, there have been plenty of new housing developments, new people, lots of new people coming into the area. So yeah, there's lots of changes that have occurred, and not always for the better.
It seems like that the people that have been brought into this community from the developers are either retirement type individuals or people that are just wanted to get out of the city and commute to their work and didn't want to live in a city atmosphere.
Dade City's downtown area has transformed itself over the years. Commercial buildings that once housed a pharmacy or a jewelry store have been replaced by trendy antique and specialty shops. Out on Main Street, the old Dade City hardware store is still open for business. John Newsom bought the store in 1962 from the original owner, who started it in 1945. This is a hardware store from the past. Walking down these aisles, you feel as if time has stopped. But Newsom knows it has not. New brand name home improvement stores have opened nearby, but that doesn't bother him.
Change is inevitable. We're going to have it in spite of what all we do. And all these people that are trying not to have it, they're going to get it anyway.
But the unique features that make Cedar Key and Dade City authentic communities are nonetheless threatened, ironically by people seeking real community.
Their sheer numbers could overwhelm it. And that's what's happened in most of Florida. The sheer numbers of people coming in overwhelm any connection to the past and any understanding of what's unique about that community because the numbers overwhelm it and make it less unique. It's no longer unique, it's just a mass of humanity, and that's what's happened in much of Florida.
The new urbanism is a solution to the problems of suburban sprawl. It is now seen, I think, by a lot of disparate groups to be part of the solution. In the same way that the first suburbia was considered to be a solution to the problems of the city.
In the 1970s, there was a sense that development throughout Florida was out of control. At the state level, a new breed of progressive politicians set about enacting growth management laws to rein in the sprawl of subdivisions and strip malls. By the 1980s, an architectural backlash against sprawl developed, which spawned a movement that espoused pedestrian-friendly communities.
At its core, new urbanism is a return to town building the way it was done prior to World War II. Before World War II, towns were designed with pedestrians and people in mind. Since World War II, we've started designing towns with the automobile in mind. So the boulevards got broader, parking lots got bigger, homes got more spread out. Suddenly you've got subdivisions outside of town and you have to use a car. Public transportation becomes more of an issue. So all of the issues that we've seen associated with urban sprawl over the decades have just become magnified and intensified from this fundamental shift in the way we think about town planning. So new urbanism is a return to, again, that ancient architectural and town planning wisdom that says that towns should be designed with people in mind.
The other thing that makes new urbanism promising is that it gives people who are new to a place, and I think it's perhaps why it's so important in Florida, a new community can develop perhaps more densely and have some sense of immediate community if they're in something that's already called a town and they think they're moving into something that is already one of these communities.
The Florida Panhandle became the laboratory for new urbanism. Along a 20-mile stretch, a series of communities represent the maturing of the new urbanist ideas. The first illustration was a small village called Seaside. Designed in a semicircle, Seaside is a quarter-mile from center to edge. A commercial center surrounds a green with two diagonal axes that extend to the back corners.
It has a grid of streets. The blocks are small with frequent intersections, and all of the streets end up with a pavilion on the edge of the Gulf. So the public face of this village on the Gulf has not been obliterated by private development. It in fact provides much access to that great public amenity, the Gulf of Mexico.
Laura Granberry and her husband moved to Seaside 5 years ago. They are among the town's 30 full-time residents. For her, Seaside is a delightful urban meets beach environment.
I can walk out my door, I can go into stores, and people know me. There's many days where we never even get in our car. I mean, we can go up to the market here, we can ride our bikes up to the larger grocery stores. So that is completely different than anywhere else I've ever lived. And I like that. I like that it's almost very European. So it just, I don't know, it just seemed like a little perfect little place.
I think success kind of got the best of them, and so the more recent houses have been increasingly larger and more expensive. As a result, most people as I understand it, who own houses there don't live there year-round. They visit, they may rent them out, and it's really impossible to develop a physical community in that context.
About the time that Seaside opened, another planned development was emerging in the Orlando area, called Celebration.
Disney needed to do something with an excess 10,000 acres of land. They had major environmental issues that they needed to solve and major transportation issues that they needed to solve. And Celebration was a comprehensive strategy to do something special with that 10,000 acres versus just sell it to another theme park developer, because frankly there was just so much land there. Michael Eisner, I have to give him the credit for saying, I'm not going to do another just ordinary subdivision. If it's not going to be special, then we're not going to do it.
Disney's development team modeled Celebration after small American towns and neighborhoods from the early 1900s. As a second-generation new urbanist community, Celebration built on and improved the design principles found in Seaside. Celebration tends to evoke strong reactions in people. Some fall in love with the architecture, saying they prefer its neo-traditional looks to most cookie-cutter subdivisions. Others hate it because they see Celebration as an artificial movie set community with oppressive rules.
Celebration will get a lot of criticism because, you know, it was an early adapter. I think Disney really gets all the credit in the world for showing everybody that you can do 10,000 acres in a unique way that nobody had done before other than on a very small scale.
With the success of Seaside and Celebration, new urbanism gained in popularity. Back up in the Panhandle Laboratory, Rosemary Beach, another small-scale new urbanist resort town, was built.
And Rosemary Beach corrects the deficiencies of Seaside. So we can always say, well, Rosemary Beach only makes new mistakes. And then when Alice Beach came along 8 years later, we did the same rundown on Rosemary Beach and moved on to correcting additional things.
We're only about 4 or 5% complete here. Eventually, all 160 acres will have homes, parks, playgrounds, shops, and we also have a 21-acre nature preserve that's set aside to the north side of town. This community is designed to be standing here 300 or 400 years from now. Much more of a European approach to building rather than the temporary American approach where in 30 years they're going to come in and, bulldoze it down and put up something else.
As a fourth-generation new urbanist community, Alice Beach is considered the crown jewel of Florida's Emerald Coast. It boasts that it is an oasis of luxury built to exacting standards.
I think one of the things that's extraordinary about Alice Beach that it's really doing that I think can matter and can really have an impact is, I think in the 70s and 80s there was an unfortunate myth created that being green means making sacrifices. You can be green and live in a very beautiful environment at the same time. With Alice Beach, of course, this is a luxury development, but it shouldn't be taken that being, green costs more or being fortified costs more. This is by definition, a luxury beach resort town. But what I think has to happen periodically is you have to have places that are developed that become focal points for inspiration.
Yet among many urban designers, new urbanist towns fail to deliver. They are unaffordable for the average family. They're usually built on virgin land away from urban centers, making car trips to and from necessary. And with few full-time residents, they struggle to create real community.
So I think the actual acceptance of new urbanism now is a function of there are not 5 demonstration projects, there's 5,000. Many of them poorly done. They're suburbs with front porches, and they haven't really solved anything. They're not closer to urban districts. They haven't really reduced vehicle miles traveled. I think the whole movement, if you will be damaged by poor actors in the world of new urbanism, but I think the label will go away of new urbanism. I think it will just go away, and it's just going to be community building.
I think we have to check back in about 150 years on Seaside, but I think when you walk from your office in Atlanta as a weekend warrior to your SUV and drive it to Seaside and interact with mostly folks just like yourself, that's not the kind of vibrant, diverse community that places like Cedar Key has.
I think new urbanism has taken on a definition, and that is that it's largely a niche community, primarily, if not exclusively, residential with only minimal commercial to support that population. What Florida needs is not a series of niches. It needs a strategy of how it is going to organize its increasing population growth, particularly the suburban growth between places like Miami and Fort Lauderdale, or between Tampa and Orlando.
There will always be a part of Florida that is a place where people come to retire, play golf or play tennis, and take life in the slow lane. But you will also see at the same time the development of true cities, true urban centers like Miami, like Fort Lauderdale, like Orlando.
Despite the current economic downturn and the temporary slowdown in growth, demographers still project Florida's population will increase.
We're still estimating that growth will be in the neighborhood of 2.5 million a decade for the next couple of decades, which would put us at around 24 to 25 million by 2030. And that's a little lower than what we had projected 5 years ago. But we've seen the biggest slowdown in Florida's population growth since just after World War II.
While some developers will strive to push development farther out beyond current boundaries, others are looking back to the urban centers.
In the 70s and the 80s, suburbs just sprang up like an oak tree, moving out and out and out and out. And the neighborhoods in around the city declined. But in the 90s, something wonderful happened. People got tired of spending an hour on Interstate 4 to get to their job. They got tired of being late to the Little League game and spending less and less time with their children. And so young families started moving back into those close-in neighborhoods. And now, if you look at College Park and Delaney Park and Cherokee, those are the most desirable neighborhoods anywhere around and have become very stable and very economically viable in the marketplace. So I would love to see more of that happen.
More than any other place in Florida, Orlando has been the poster child for sprawl. Yet the Orlando area also illustrates how redevelopment within the urban core can create vibrant communities. In 1999, the Orlando Naval Training Station closed. The site, which is about 2 miles from downtown Orlando, had been an active military base since the 1940s. Developers turned the former military base into a planned community called Baldwin Park. Drawing from the new urbanist design principles, now called traditional neighborhood development, Baldwin Park has no gates or walls. Sidewalks are wide and pedestrian-friendly.
One of the most unique things about Baldwin Park is the people who live here, where they come from. New home communities are normally populated by people moving to the state or moving to the region. As many as typically, I believe it's 70% of the buyers in a new home community are relocation buyers. 30% might be from around the area. In Baldwin Park, 90% of our residents move from Orlando or Winter Park, from right in our area. They move from within a 10-mile circle. You know, they already have other networks established, their friends, the places they hang out, their churches, their schools. They're not changing for the most part. They are moving here because they just like the place, they want a new house, but they don't have to change all their old patterns. And that does a lot towards building kind of real community faster.
Three miles north of Baldwin Park is Winter Park. It too has a deep history dating back to 1885 as a resort destination.
The great thing about Winter Park is our founding fathers designed Winter Park 120 years ago based on walking to a train, and they put this great green in the center of Winter Park. On the 4th of July, you have the best communal gathering in Central Florida where everybody comes to this park to celebrate the 4th of July. Now, you can't do that in subdivisions because, you know, probably your best space is around a retention pond.
I always think of a place like Winter Park. It does have a commercial main street, but that is facing a park, a large green which has the railroad station on the other side. So there is, a great sense of character made by the fact that the connection to the rest of the world, the natural environment, and then the economic life of the community are all together there.
Another urban core that pulls all three ingredients of community and place together is Miami Beach. Miami was an invented resort destination. Miami Beach, one could argue, was never an example of great community design.
If you look at the way the city was developed initially, it was a very simple grid. It was designed to sell real estate. It was designed to sell vacations. And it didn't have many higher aspirations. Although the structure itself was relatively sound. The grid comprised small blocks that were easily walkable. The ocean, the beach were close by. The bay was on the other side.
What makes Miami Beach really special, says Schulman, is how it evolved.
So as the city developed, new layers of housing, new layers of resort buildings, resort retail started to layer into it. That made it a kind of a richer place.
Miami Beach's success as a global tourist attraction is in large part due to the fact that it is an authentic community. That is not just a strip of hotels and restaurants catering to tourists. That it has many neighborhoods, it has multiple dimensions. It's a great cultural center. South Beach is not just a tourist attraction, it's a real living, working 24/7 community.
There was a point in the 1970s when Miami Beach fell on hard times. The tourist industry had collapsed, and Miami Beach collapsed with it. It wasn't until the late 1980s that Miami Beach began to re-emerge as new residents returned it to life.
The residents of Miami Beach had a huge part in the redevelopment of Miami Beach. A lot of people think of Miami Beach as a rehabilitation story or as a historic preservation story, and it is. But that historic preservation story came not purely out of an interest in the buildings, but out of an interest in the lifestyle of the people who occupied them.
Novelist Brian Antoni moved to South Beach more than 20 years ago. As one of the early resettlers of South Beach, he bought and renovated a rundown Art Deco apartment building. Antoni was part of the movement to restore South Beach and its architecture.
South Beach is like Mayberry on ecstasy. It's very much a small town, but it's just exaggerated and freaked out. Well, one good thing about South Beach is we walk. And when you're not in cars like in the rest of the Florida, you actually talk to people and you run into people and you see people and you say hello. And I think that's why South Beach, which most people don't think is a community, probably is more of a community than a lot of places in Florida. South Beach itself, not Miami, is very much a small town, with just a small town with like a mentality that isn't small town, with a very open accepting mentality, which is hard to find. I don't know where else you really have that in this country.
Jeff Donnelly and his wife moved to Miami Beach in 1986. Today, he says Miami Beach is a living, vibrant residential community as well as a tourist and entertainment community.
My wife and I walk up to Lincoln Road, which is about a 20-minute walk from here. We're almost guaranteed to meet somebody that we know. Whereas I notice my grandchildren, their lives are totally programmed. They have ballet at 4 and they have to adjust making sure that there's a car available and the car has to go there and then it has to go to here. But I really do think that they're missing something in terms of being around people who are of different ages, of different backgrounds, of different ways of thinking even. Because when you get one of those developments, there's a sameness and a homogeneity to that kind of community. Now some people find that safer. They feel safer in that circumstance. I think actually they're making a mistake. They'd be safer here. To me, a community is an accumulation of people who both depend on one another and who also are willing to contribute to one another's well-being. People who are involved in a community recognize that they derive a lot of benefit from being in the community, and therefore they're willing at some level or other to give back.
Yet developments continue to spread farther and farther from city centers, stretching infrastructure and services.
I feel very strongly that it's a stupid idea, especially as neighborhoods move further and further from city centers and from services, as gas gets more expensive, as infrastructure, including electricity and water, gets more expensive to provide, and our current infrastructure needs to be replaced, roads, sewers, water, all that stuff. Whether or not we will quit doing it is another question. In Florida, the community that advocates development is so strong that it's really a challenge to reduce growth unless there are severe economic disincentives. And certainly that's the case now. There are lots of suburban developments that are going into foreclosure in Florida because Florida, as much as any state in the country, overbuilt in the last couple of years. So I hope that we will build fewer suburbs and then instead build back into the cities.
We, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage.
Florida is once again at a crossroad about how it wants to approach its future. The Sunshine State can continue repeating the past, or it can model, as Bruce Stevenson has written, a new pattern of American life.
Florida is probably the most modern landscape in the United States because it was essentially unlivable until we re-engineered it. In the 1939 World's Fair, the most interesting and successful exhibit was by General Motors, where they showed people driving everywhere. So I think that vision of the future was perfectly put together in Florida. But after 50 years of doing the same thing, no matter what you do, it's going to have its downside.
The problems facing us today, it seems to me, are so significant, they give me cause for hope. Because the only way we're going to address them is come together as a people to solve them. And that gives me hope that we will begin to share a common sense of purpose in Florida, and that we will build a community out of this melange of people and growth that we've seen in the past.
Many urban planners, architects, and civic leaders acknowledge that growth and suburban sprawl are unsustainable. The old approach of developing new suburban areas on virgin land only stretches infrastructure.
I think if we continue sprawling out over the landscape and creating communities, new communities without a sense of place, while simultaneously abandoning sort of our older cities, taking over new land, we're just going to intensify the ecological and economic and social crises which are converging at this moment.
As in the years following the crash of 1926, people struggled with a new vision of what Florida might be. That question of vision remains today. What will Florida live like in 2030?
The next real challenge for cities like our own is to find a way to redevelop those first-tier suburbs that were great when they were built in the 1950s, but have now been superseded by more rings of subdivisions and suburbs. And we need desperately to find a way to bring them back, but it's not easy. It's not easy to redevelop an old shopping center compared to building a new one out in an orange grove that's just sitting there empty.
Earl Starnes believes that strong leadership and real creativity will be needed if Florida is to retain its legacy and sense of place.
We need mature and thoughtful leadership at local level, regional level, and state level, and we have not had that in the last 15 years. It seems to me that the politics of today is the politics of today and not tomorrow. And I haven't seen the state legislature nor any governors over the last several years who really had a vision for the state, and that's what you have to have.
Yet the vision for the state also lies in the hands of every Floridian. Everyone in the Sunshine State must be invested in their communities, and they must be willing to contribute to one another's well-being. Without that, creating real communities will never happen.
This program was made possible by the Florida Humanities Council. We come from all over, and we become one state, where we share in the history and become part of the culture that is Florida. The Florida Humanities Council, bringing Floridians together by sharing the stories of our state. And by the National Endowment for the Humanities,